The wind across the Arizona plains carried dust like a whisper of old wars. Daniel Carter had ridden those lonely miles for 15 years, long enough that the land itself seemed to recognize the slow rhythm of his horse. People in the nearest settlement called him the quiet rancher. Some called him stubborn. Others simply said he preferred the company of cattle and wind over the noise of men. On that cold evening, the sky had the color of fading iron, and the sun was sinking behind the red cliffs when Daniel noticed something strange ahead along the cottonwood trees that followed the narrow creek. At first, it looked like a torn blanket caught in the branches. Then his horse slowed on its own. Daniel narrowed his eyes. The shape was moving. His stomach tightened as he guided the horse closer through the tall grass. The closer he came, the clearer the terrible truth became. A young girl was hanging from the low branch of a cottonwood tree, a rough rope tied around her wrists, holding her arms high above her head so her feet barely touched the ground. Her dark hair hung forward like a curtain, hiding her face. Around her neck, someone had tied a wooden board with crude black letters carved deep into it. Daniel dismounted slowly, every instinct warning him something about this place was wrong. The message on the board read in jagged letters, "White man don't forgive." He stared at the sign for a long moment. The words were written in broken English, but the anger behind them was clear as gunfire. The girl stirred weakly when she heard his boots in the dirt. She lifted her head just enough for him to see her face. She couldn't have been older than 15. Her cheeks were bruised and streaked with dried tears. Her eyes were dark and burning with fear and defiance at the same time. Apache, Daniel thought immediately. He had seen enough of the tribes who moved through the mountains to recognize the patterns in the beads tied into her hair. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a dry rasp. "Go away." The wind creaked through the tree branches above them. Daniel glanced around the empty plains. Whoever had done this had left her here as a message. Maybe for settlers, maybe for the tribe. Either way, it was cruel work. Daniel stepped forward and reached for the rope. The girl shook her head quickly, panic flashing across her face. "If you help, they come back." Daniel cut the rope anyway. The knife sliced clean and her body dropped forward. He caught her before she hit the dirt. She was lighter than he expected, thin from hunger and exhaustion. Her legs collapsed under her weight when he tried to set her down. He removed the wooden sign and tossed it aside. The carved words stared up at the sky like a curse. "Who did this to you?" he asked quietly. She looked toward the distant hills before answering. "White riders, angry ones." Daniel felt a slow burn of anger in his chest. He had seen that kind before. Men who believed revenge was the same thing as justice. He helped her sit against the trunk of the cottonwood tree and offered his canteen. She drank greedily, water running down her chin as if she hadn't tasted any for days. The sun finally dropped behind the cliffs, leaving the land in a deep, violet shadow. Daniel knew the temperature would fall fast once night arrived. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated before whispering, "Aiyana." He nodded once. "Daniel." The wind picked up again, rattling the dry leaves. Somewhere far away, a coyote cried. Aiyana's eyes suddenly widened with fear. "They will come back," she whispered. Daniel followed her gaze toward the open plains behind them. At first he saw nothing, then faint shapes appeared against the fading horizon. Riders. 3, maybe 4. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Looks like you're right," he muttered. Aiyana grabbed his sleeve with surprising strength. "You must leave. If they see you helping me, they kill you too." Daniel stared toward the approaching riders for a long moment. 15 years alone on the frontier had taught him many things. One of them was that men capable of tying a child to a tree usually didn't stop at one crime. He turned and untied his horse from the low branch. Then he looked back at the frightened girl sitting in the dust. The riders were closer now, their silhouettes growing sharper in the fading light. Daniel reached down and helped her to her feet. "Can you ride?" She shook her head weakly. He sighed once, already knowing the answer. Then he lifted her into the saddle. The sound of hooves in the distance was getting louder now. Aiyana looked back toward the riders, terror spreading across her face. Daniel placed his boot in the stirrup and climbed up behind her. "Hold tight," he said. The horse turned toward the narrow trail leading into the canyon. Behind them, the riders shouted something angry across the wind. Daniel kicked the horse forward, and the animal leapt into motion, racing toward the dark canyon mouth as the first gunshot cracked across the plains. The bullet tore through the cottonwood leaves where they had been standing only seconds before. Aiyana gripped the saddle horn with white knuckles as the horse thundered into the canyon shadows. Daniel didn't slow down. The narrow canyon walls swallowed the fading light, and the sound of hooves echoed like thunder around them. He knew those riders wouldn't give up easily, not after leaving a message like that hanging from a tree. And as the canyon grew darker around them, Daniel realized something else. Whoever those men were, this chase was only beginning. And as the canyon grew darker around them, Daniel realized something else. Whoever those men were, this chase was only beginning. The wind whistled through the narrow canyon walls, carrying the angry shouts of the riders behind them. Daniel pressed his heels into the horse's flanks, urging the animal faster, weaving between jagged rocks and sudden dips in the path. Aiyana clung tightly to his chest, her small body trembling from cold, fear, and the sheer force of the ride. He could feel her heartbeat against his own, wild and frantic, and he whispered softly, "Keep still. Don't move. You'll be safe if you hold on." The riders weren't far behind. Shadows bounced against the canyon walls as they rode with furious determination, their guns swinging dangerously in the dim twilight. One of them fired a shot. The bullet thudded into the canyon wall mere inches from the horse, sending pebbles and dust into the air. Daniel's teeth clenched. "They're reckless," he muttered, "and they don't know these trails like I do." The canyon narrowed abruptly. Sharp rocks jutted from the walls like the spines of some giant creature, and the path twisted unpredictably. Daniel's horse navigated expertly, trained through years of riding across these unforgiving lands. Behind them, the riders had to slow, forcing their mounts to clumsily negotiate the same sharp turns. He allowed himself a fleeting sense of relief. You're fast," Aiyana whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of hooves. "I've had practice," he replied grimly. "Hold on, we're not out yet." They rounded a bend and Daniel spotted a narrow ledge along the canyon side, barely wide enough for a horse. He veered sharply, skimming close to the jagged rocks. One rider hesitated, almost losing balance, and another swore loudly as his horse stumbled on the loose gravel. Aiyana gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "Are they going to fall?" "Maybe," Daniel said quietly, not looking back. "But they won't stop. They're desperate, and desperate men make mistakes." The canyon opened briefly into a dry creek bed. Daniel slowed just enough to allow the horse to leap across a small gap in the rocks, landing safely on the far side. Aiyana let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, but relief was short-lived. Up ahead, the canyon twisted again, and Daniel could see movement in the distance. More riders, coming from another path, had joined the pursuit. It was clear they had anticipated his escape route. He turned to Aiyana. "We need a plan. You trust me?" She nodded without hesitation. "I trust you." Daniel's mind raced. He knew of a hidden alcove along the cliffs, a place few had discovered that could offer temporary cover. It was risky, narrow, almost impossible to navigate for those unfamiliar, but he had no choice. "Hold tight," he said again. The horse galloped faster, muscles straining, hooves tearing through the loose soil. Daniel guided them toward the cliffside alcove, ducking low as the horse leapt over fallen boulders. Shots rang out again from behind. Dust and rocks spattered around them. Daniel's arm ached from holding Aiyana close, but he didn't let it show. Every second counted. The alcove appeared ahead, dark and almost hidden beneath overhanging rock. Daniel angled the horse carefully, and they slipped inside just as the first of the pursuing riders crested the canyon path. The shadows swallowed them almost completely. Aiyana clung to him, her eyes wide in awe and fear. "We're hidden?" "Yes," Daniel whispered, "for now, but they won't give up, not until they get you back, or worse." They waited in silence, listening to the hooves pounding past the alcove. The echo of shouts faded slowly into the distance. Daniel's heart still raced, but he allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. Why did they do this to me?" Aiyana asked, her voice trembling. Daniel looked down at her, his face hard but kind. "Some men think fear gives them power. Some men think the world belongs only to those willing to take it." He shook his head. "But you're not their property. Not now, not ever." The sky above the canyon turned a deep indigo. Stars began to pierce the dark, and the moon rose, casting silver light across the jagged cliffs. Daniel knew the night would be long. The riders would search until dawn, and he needed a plan. He studied the terrain, memorizing every ridge, every shadow, every narrow ledge. There was a route through the cliffs, hidden paths known only to those who had spent decades in the wilderness. If they could navigate it, they could escape. If not, the consequences would be fatal. "I have an idea," Daniel said quietly. "We're going to climb, slowly, quietly. One misstep and they'll hear us." Aiyana nodded, trembling but resolute. Daniel handed her a small coil of rope he had brought along for emergencies. "Keep this close, trust me." Step by step, they began their slow ascent along the cliff face, using handholds and narrow ledges. The canyon seemed endless, shadows twisting like living things around them. Each movement required precision. One wrong move, and they would fall. Halfway up, Daniel paused, peering over the edge. The riders were regrouping below, talking and cursing, unaware of the two fugitives above. Daniel exhaled, allowing himself a quiet smile. "They think they've cornered us," he whispered to Aiyana, "but the mountain has other plans." The night deepened. Stars glittered like distant fires, the canyon breathing cold and silent around them. Daniel and Aiyana continued their climb, moving further away from danger with every careful step. Hours seemed to pass. The sound of the pursuers faded. At last they reached a hidden ledge, thick with overgrown brush. Daniel lowered Aiyana gently. "We'll rest here until first light," he said. Aiyana sank into the sparse grass, exhausted. Daniel stood watch, rifle in hand, scanning the canyon below. He knew the men would not stop. They never did. But he also knew that he had something they didn't: knowledge of the land, and the determination to protect the girl who had no one else. Dawn would come soon, and with it, a chance to escape, a chance to survive, and a chance to turn the hunters into the hunted. The story of Daniel and Aiyana was far from over. The plains, the canyons, and the endless sky held more secrets yet, and more danger than either of them could imagine. The bond forged in fear and flight was beginning to grow stronger, and one thing was certain: neither would ever forget this night, the night the Apache girl almost died, and the rancher decided he would not let it happen. Not to her, not to anyone. The canyon whispered around them, and Daniel knew the chase had only begun.